We are going to talk today about conflict in a virtual world. And to start with, I'm going to introduce myself a bit more completely. So I have spent 15 years in the adult learning business or so. And in that time, most of that time I've spent teaching soft skills, which includes conflict resolution, conflict de-escalation, which is a little different, leadership skills, management skills, and I've taught everybody from frontline folks in contact centers all the way to VP level people on creative thinking. So done a whole lot of different things when it comes to those teaching roles. I spent 10 years, as John mentioned, in what I call the high stress public transit industry. And the reason it's high stress is because it's one of those few businesses where your customers actually don't really pay for your service. They pay a part of it, but the majority of it is paid by taxpayers. And so as a result, you have several different bosses. You have the riders, you have the public, and you have the government. And all of those customers think they can do your job better than you can. So I suspect if you're an engineer, you've probably experienced this in the past. But that was sort of my experience for about 10 years. And as a result, I spent a lot of time managing conflict and a lot of time teaching people how to manage conflict with a whole bunch of different stakeholders and a whole bunch of different colleagues. So that's what we're going to talk about today, but in a virtual setting. So there are lots of different types of conflicts that we could discuss, and lots of different types of situations where conflicts can occur. Today, we're really going to focus on conflict at work between colleagues. So I hope that's what you're looking for today. That's what you're going to get. There are other webinars I've done on de-escalating customers and frontline folks, but this is all about you've got a conflict with a colleague at work, maybe somebody who works with you, somebody who works for you, somebody who you report to, and we're going to talk about how to manage that conflict and come up with win-win solutions that benefit everyone, but do that without really being able to be face-to-face. And so that's the challenge of what a whole lot of people, probably everybody on this webinar, is dealing with right now. So to do that, we're going to talk about 3 principles of conflict management, and then we're going to talk at the end about how to do this digitally. First, we're going to talk about emotional management. Then we're going to talk about taking responsibility, and then we're going to talk about focusing on resolution versus winning. And finally, we're going to talk about how to do all these things and tie it all together in a neat package at the end in a digital context when you can't be face-to-face with people and you can't just go and knock on someone's cubicle wall and say, hey, can we talk about this? And you're not able to do that. So that's what the focus is really going to be on. I'm going to say in advance, though, that if you don't have a lot of experience reading or researching or looking into conflict resolution, welcome to a whole new world of study. And this is a topic I address a lot when I talk about it in places like LinkedIn and with clients. And that's the whole notion that when it comes to skills, hard is easy and soft is hard. So learning hard skills like technical knowledge around maybe it's density of materials or potential strength of materials or flow of electricity, those hard skills are things that for a lot of people are not that difficult to acquire. But when it comes to soft skills, these can take a lifetime to master. And I will say I first started down the whole road on studying conflict resolution when I started in training about 15 years ago. And in that time, I've learned an awful lot about adult learning and training design and delivery, and I consider myself an expert. I would say I still have a very long way to go when it comes to understanding, when it comes to putting into practice the principles of conflict resolution. So the next 45 minutes, you're going to get to a point where you probably just know what you need to know at this point, but hopefully you're going to spend much of the rest of your life learning to master these skills. So to start with, we're going to talk about emotional management and emotional self-management. And let me just bring my mouse over here. And we're going to talk about the importance of, in a conflict situation, when you're in a meeting or you're on a Zoom call or you open up an email and something is not good, or you're in a Zoom meeting and somebody says something that you have a big problem with, and we're going to talk about managing your own emotions is the first step to resolving conflict and getting where you need to be. And the first thing you need to learn about is a piece of your brain called the amygdala. If you know this, I apologize. If you don't, though, this is a really, really important principle. So the base of your spinal cord, the top of your spinal cord, sort of in here, has what a lot of people refer to as the rat brain or the reptile brain, but it's basically a 50,000-year-old piece of firmware that has never been upgraded. And so what you're looking at is a piece of your brain that's really concerned with 3 things. One is finding something to eat. 2, not being eaten by something else, i.e. not becoming a victim of somebody else attacking, and 3, making more babies. That's really what your amygdala cares about. So if you're in a situation where you are where one of those 3 things occurs, you either feel under threat, or you see a potential prey, or you see somebody you're attracted to, your amygdala can take over and cause your brain to do funny things. It can cause your words to stumble. It can cause things that you wouldn't normally say to come out of your mouth. It can cause a lot of really intense physiological reactions. So when you are in a situation at work, when you perhaps encounter an opportunity, maybe there's a promotion or a project you really want to work on, or opportunity for a bonus, all these things occur, your amygdala can interpret that as prey, and it can hijack your brain and force you into a mode of doing and thinking things that may not be consistent with really who you think you are. Similarly, and this is the most important thing, that if you're in a conflict situation, your brain can interpret your 50,000-year-old piece of firmware basically interprets that as a saber-toothed tiger. And at that point, you have 2 choices, whether to run or to fight. And so that's the fight or flight reaction, which hopefully you're familiar with. If you remember back to grade 7 or 8 biology, this is the fight or flight reaction that a lot of us are familiar with, and that you really need to be aware of when you're trying to manage your own emotions. The first thing your body does is, in your hands and your feet, it pulls back the blood vessels from your hands and feet and concentrates them on your core. So basically, it's worried that if you get into a fight and you injure yourself, again, 50,000-year-old firmware, nobody's actually getting into a fight in the office, I hope, but your 50,000-year-old firmware is saying if you pull back the blood vessels, you won't bleed to death. And so it concentrates all the heat and the blood in your core, and that causes you to literally get hot under your collar. And the way this whole thing triggers and starts out is by your breathing. Your breathing gets shallow, and that triggers the fight or flight reaction. And that can lead to things like sweaty palms, perspiration, all these sort of physiological things that occur. And at that point, you know you're in a full-on amygdala hijack, and you need to get out of that before you can resolve the conflict. So if you're in a Zoom meeting, maybe that's time to turn your camera off, because everyone is probably going to see what's happening and know that your emotions are elevated. So mute your mic, turn your camera off, and take a moment to compose yourself. And the way you do that is by controlling your breathing. So it's those quick intakes of breath that trigger the fight or flight reaction. And if you are not managing your breathing, you are not managing your emotions. There's 2 things you can do. One is, if you've ever had an excited toddler or a young person having a meltdown in front of you and you've told them, stop, take 3 deep breaths, that's really good advice. And if you're in an amygdala hijack and you recognize that your emotions are elevated, taking a couple of deep breaths can do the trick. If that doesn't do the trick, if that's not sufficient, there's a technique called square breathing, which can often really help you manage those emotions. This is a really old meditation technique, like thousands of years old, that involves breathing in and counting to 4, holding your breath in for a count of 4, breathing out for a count of 4, and holding your breath out for a count of 4, and then just repeating that in a square, 4, 4, 4, 4, over and over again until your emotions start to come back into control and you start to manage them again. So I know lots of people have used this in lots of situations. I have to fall back on it occasionally. I'm pretty hot-tempered. And so this is a really powerful tool for managing your breathing. And once you've got that amygdala hijack under control, at that point, you need to focus on the conversation that's going on inside your head. We're going to talk a lot in this session about avoiding assumptions of other people's motivations. But at this point, if you're in that heightened emotional state, you are probably making a lot of assumptions about the other person's emotions, and you need to be aware of what that conversation is in your head and start to change it. Similarly, if you can get a position where your amygdala is hijacking your brain, others can do it too. And I always love this quote: never in the history of calm down has anyone ever calmed down by being told to calm down. And people can get defensive for the same reasons that you'd get defensive. They feel like their credibility's been attacked. They feel like it's been a personal attack. They feel like something you've said is offensive in some way. Different things can trigger those things. And if you are on a Zoom call or you're on a Teams meeting and you see somebody starting to raise their voice, starting to clearly get agitated, starting to display those symptoms of somebody who is in an amygdala hijack, you have that responsibility to stand down and start to begin to de-escalate the situation and not continue to do things that are going to escalate the conversation, that escalate the conflict. And that comes down to a really important piece of this whole thing, which is about taking personal responsibility. So we're going to talk a fair bit about taking personal responsibility for your role in the conflict. So a little mental exercise for you. Another sip of coffee here. I want you to think about a person you know that is constantly getting into conflict with other people. I'm hoping it's not you, but maybe it is, who's constantly getting into conflict with other people. And arguments, fights, really intense discussions, hurt feelings, all these things. And think about all of the people they get into conflict with and answer the question, are all of those people in conflict with each other all the time? Or are those people just, is that one person the constant of the equation who's always in the conflict? So is that what's going on? At that point, the question is there one constant to all of this conflict? And if so, that constant needs to learn how to take responsibility for that behavior. And if that constant is you, then you need to also address about taking responsibility for the situations that are causing the conflict. In any conflict, there's generally two sides and two things that have occurred, and two people or two groups that are in conflict. And the most effective thing you can do to begin the resolution process once you have managed your emotions is to acknowledge your role in the conflict and apologize for it in some way. This often involves swallowing your pride and maybe doing something that makes you uncomfortable, but it's the most effective tool for starting the process of de-escalating the conflict and bringing the conflict to a resolution, is to admit to what your role was in the conflict, whether you said something or did something or something that occurred on your part, and then apologizing for your role in the conflict. That is hard to do, but it's absolutely essential. And it's also essential that you do not try and do that by email. Do not try and send an email to start the process of resolving the conflict. That's the worst thing you can do. And we're going to talk about later on about how email is a terrible tool for that sort of thing, and some of the tools that are good and why they're good, but you really need to avoid starting that process by email. Second thing is you need to apologize in a genuine way. And that involves not saying, I'm sorry you felt that way, because that's really not a genuine apology, but involves saying, I'm sorry for that thing I did or said that led to this conflict or led to this feeling of upset. And that's where that apology starts to diffuse the whole situation. And in dealing with most people, and again, not everyone, but dealing with most people, once you admit to your role in the conflict and apologize for it, in the vast majority of people, that triggers them to do the same thing. That triggers them to admit to their own role in the conflict, usually to apologize for escalating things, and that begins the process of rebuilding the bridges and resolving the conflict in a way where you both end up coming out of it with something that you want. And then we'll talk about win-win solutions a little later on. Okay? So part of the reason it's so difficult to acknowledge your role in the conflict is this notion that a friend of mine came up with when he was a justice with the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. So he spent 4 years with the Human Rights Tribunal, basically telling people that they had violated people's charter rights. And it was very, very difficult to get people to admit they had done that. And often he had to use the full power of his authority to sort of bring the hammer down on people to get to acknowledge that they had done something wrong. And he came up with a theory of why this is that I think is relevant to the whole discussion. And the theory is that the reason you can rarely get people to admit to doing something wrong is that everyone is the hero of their own story. And when you try to get somebody to admit to a a negative behavior, such as in extreme examples, some things like bullying, or the example he often uses, racism. We're not even discussing that, but toxic behavior in the workplace. When you try to get somebody to admit to that behavior, just by telling them you did this badly and you've caused this conflict and caused this upset, everyone being the hero of their own story believes in their heart they're genuinely a good person for the most part. Now, some people have challenges in mental health and believe they're unworthy or some way, but in the end, everyone believes they're basically a good person. And as a result, trying to convince them that they have done something hurtful or harmful or wrong can be very, very challenging. And the first step to doing that is by going in a little vulnerable and admitting your own role in that conflict. And again, not by email. So I was asked to address another situation where conflict can occur in a work situation, especially in the engineering profession. And I wanted to spend a minute talking about that. And that is this notion of a competence gap. And a competence gap can occur in a couple of different ways. One is where you have a senior engineer and a junior engineer, and you have a senior engineer who has a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge and a lot of wisdom about not only technical stuff, but about sort of things like what's politically possible in an organization and what's likely to get approved and what's not likely to get approved. And you have a junior engineer who is very enthusiastic and has a lot of ideas and energy they want to share, and the two can clash. And wisdom and experience can clash with youth and enthusiasm, and you can create. There could be this gap in understanding that can occur. And so just want to talk for a second about how you resolve that. And I want to do it by telling a quick story about a friend of mine who is a physiotherapist. And she'd been a physiotherapist for 20 or 30 years. And she'd run a number of practicums, and she'd run a number of co-op terms for aspiring physiotherapists or physiotherapists in training. And one day she had a client in there, and she was working with a practicum student, and she had a client with her who had strained a muscle. And she gave him her usual advice and said, well, you need to apply ice for the first couple of days. And then after that, you're going to apply heat on a consistent basis. And that's going to help your body to heal the strain. And while she was doing this, her practicum student was looking really nervous and uncomfortable and really kind of awkward. And afterwards, he said to her, can I talk to you about something? And she said, okay. He said, the advice you gave to the client about the ice and the heat was not clinically accurate. And there's actually a fair bit of research in the last couple of years that has shown that that's not a good way to proceed. And she got, kind of back on her heels and was being challenged by this young guy. And her first thought was, how can he possibly claim to know more than me about this? Because I've been a physiotherapist for 30 years. And so a bit of an intense discussion ensued, and he resolved it and he said, can I share the research with you? Are you willing to read the research that I've uncovered that's sort of guiding my decision process? She thought for a minute. She said, okay, yes, you can share that research. And so he shared it with her that night, and she read it over the next couple of days and found that he was 100% correct. Ice was no longer being recommended for treating strains. The recommendation was heat all the way from the beginning to end, and the research was pretty conclusive about the situation. So what had happened in this situation, I'm going to go back a slide, that had resolved it, was the fact that both sides were respecting what everyone brought to the table, and both sides were willing to set aside their egos for just a moment in order to resolve this potential conflict. She was willing to set aside her ego and learn something new from a younger person, but he was also willing to set aside his ego long enough to defer to her experience and knowledge and treat her in a way that respected her experience and her understanding. And so if you find yourself in a bit of a competence gap with folks and you're on one end of that situation or the other, remember that it's about respect and it's about setting your own ego aside. And that can lead to, if you're a senior person, maybe you learn something that you weren't expecting, that you weren't aware of. And if you're a junior person and you treat that senior engineer with respect and a bit of deference, again, you're probably going to learn something and you're probably going to come out better for it. There's another type of confidence gap I want to address, and that is not so much competence, but motivation. And it's really important to know that in any situation, you will likely be dealing with people who have very different motivations than you do around a boardroom table or around a Zoom meeting. Again, unfortunately, this is an in-person image. It's kind of challenging to find good quality images of Zoom meetings these days. But if you've got a situation where you have a bunch of people around a proverbial virtual boardroom table who are discussing an issue, in this case, let's say for argument's sake, they're discussing renovations to a train station, because that's the world I'm familiar with. So they're discussing renovations to a train station. So let's look at some of their motivation and why there may be a gap there in those understandings. Starters, the engineer at the table, she is looking at the plan for this train station and thinking, there's a number of problems with these plans. They may be technically incorrect. The project may be unfeasible from a technical perspective. The materials are of poor quality. She's looking at it. She has a number of concerns, but she is only one of the voices around the table. Meanwhile, the project director has heard from her boss, the Minister of Transportation, and said, renovate this station. My constituents are complaining. So she has a whole different set of motivations that she's trying to deal with, that she's trying to understand. Meanwhile, the guy in charge of customers is thinking, our customers are going to love this new renovation. It opens up some bottlenecks. It lets them move around more easily. They're going to be very, very happy. The VP Finance is thinking, oh my goodness, the capital budget was established 3 years ago. There's no way we can possibly afford to pay for this. How on earth are we going to do this? And of course, the one guy in the room is always thinking, I'm starving, when's lunch? So part of addressing a competence gap may also be a part of acknowledging that it's not competence per se, it's a difference in motivation. And by understanding that people have different motivations from you in these kind of settings can go a long way towards preventing conflict from occurring in the first place, and then also helping to resolve conflict once it occurs. The most important thing to do, though, is to never assume you know someone else's motivation. I've gotten in trouble with that lots of times in my life. Never assume you know their motivation, but part of that conflict resolution process will be to try and uncover what their motivation is so that you can then come to a solution. Okay, so let's talk a bit about focusing on resolution and getting to a win-win situation. All right. So, 3 main principles for getting to a resolution is the first principle I'm going to share with you. This may seem a little unusual, but it's really important. And I'm approaching this not only from somebody who specializes in conflict resolution, but also somebody who specializes in navigating political organizations. And so you're going to get a bit of that sort of organizational politics 101 from this as well. So I apologize if you're already an expert at this, but I think that's part of the whole conflict resolution piece. So the first principle is that the relationship is more important than the task. And if you take nothing else from this 45-minute process and this deck today, please remember that the relationship is more important than the task. Maintaining a good working relationship with people that you will need to work with probably again down the road is certainly more valuable than achieving what you perceive as a win in terms of getting your way on a project. Unless obviously there's a safety concern and someone's going to die. I get with engineers that could often be an issue, but generally, if it's not coming down to safety, the relationship is more important than the task. And if you become someone who is known as being able to save relationships and build relationships and reach these positive resolutions for conflict, it's going to do your career a whole world of good. Second thing to understand is that facts are more important than feelings when it comes to resolving conflict. And that if you focus on the facts of a situation and focus on what actually happened versus perceptions of what happened, this is where we get into not assuming someone's motivation, not guessing at what someone's motivation is. Focus on the facts of what happens in the conversation. This was said, or in this email, this was written, or on the Zoom meeting, this happened. Focus on those facts, and that's how you get to a successful resolution. If you start making assumptions or start getting your facts incorrect, like for instance, you say somebody said something and they didn't, that can only escalate a conflict. But if you focus on those facts versus emotions or impressions, you're going to get to a resolution much quicker. And finally, in this particular little thing is you really want to make sure you're focusing on win-win solutions. So what is a win-win solution? A win-win solution is just a fancy word for a compromise. And it's a solution where you get a bit of what you want, they get a bit of what they want, and everyone goes away feeling like they have achieved part of their motivations in the conflict. And so win-win solutions and becoming known for creating win-win solutions, if there's no other reason to do it other than it's really, really good for your career. If you become known as somebody who's always coming up with win-win solutions that make everybody go away happy, you are already demonstrating the behaviors that are required of a leader. And if you're not in a leadership role and aspire to be in a leadership role, this is a great way of demonstrating to your peers and to your management that you are ready for leadership and promotable. So if your aspiration is to move up in an organization, this is a great tool for doing that, is becoming known as the person who creates the win-win solutions and makes everybody go away feeling happy. If you aren't someone who aspires to moving up in an organization and you just want to go around creating win-win solutions, there's another really, really good motivation for that is, if you do that on a consistent basis, you create allies in your organization and people who will have your back when things go south. And from my experience in a very, very political crown corporation, there was nothing more valuable than being in a meeting and having said or done something that was probably not accurate or stumbled in some way, and having a whole bunch of people in the room come to my defense, because in the past I had brokered a win-win solution with them that had let them go away happy and with their dignity intact. So it's all about focusing on resolution rather than focusing on winning, and that's a key element of that whole conflict resolution piece. Weird pop culture aside, for the late 70s, early 80s, this is a TV show from that era, a miniseries based on a book by a guy named James Clavell called Shogun. Why am I bringing this up? Because a lot of what we take for granted as management theory right now, understandings, came from this era. And so Shogun was a mini series in this late 70s, early 80s, in a book that had kind of a laughable premise of an 19th century American going to feudal Japan and becoming a samurai. So I'm sure you can imagine how incredibly popular that was in the early 80s. But the important part of the series that it introduced to Western audiences, for probably the first time, the whole notion of saving face, the whole notion of creating a resolution to a situation that allowed everybody to go away with their dignity intact. Because in the past, especially in management and business in North America up to that point, it had been all about there are winners and there are losers, and there was no compromise. You had to win or you lost. There's a old football coach who's famous for saying second place is the first loser. And so that was the culture up until that point. And Shogun really introduced a number of Japanese cultural concepts to North American audiences. And what I think is one of the most important was this notion of saving face and allowing somebody else to stand down from a situation and maintain their dignity and their honor. And this is a key part of a win-win solution, is allowing the other person to escape with their dignity intact and to not be embarrassed in front of their peers or their colleagues, and not lose the respect of their peers or their colleagues in any way. And it's a really, really crucial part of that win-win solution. The solution, yes, I know I said to focus on facts versus feelings, but there's a feelings element to the solution as well that allows people to escape with their dignity intact. In training world, we call it protecting the learner's esteem. And so there's situations in a training class that happen all the time where somebody may say something that's really not appropriate. And as a trainer, you have a role to get them out of that situation and keep their self-esteem intact. In conflict resolution, this is just as important. Okay, so now here's the part that you've all been waiting for. Let's talk about some of the digital tools for managing the conflict and how you do that in a digital way. So get to the right position here. And let's talk about some of these tools. So we're going to talk a bit about praise and criticism. We're going to talk about asking permission for conversations. We're going to talk about the most dangerous button in your office. We're going to talk about angry first drafts, and we're going to talk about the importance and power of tone and nonverbal communication in a discussion. All right. So to start with, praise and criticism. So this is true both in a virtual and an in-person world, but it's probably even more true in a virtual world, in that you always need to be careful to praise in public and criticize in private. We're going to talk about the danger of reply all in just a moment, but there's probably going to come a moment in your working day when you're in a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting, or somebody has hit reply all on an email and they have done something wrong or made a mistake or done something that upsets you, and your temptation is going to be to address that in front of everyone. And that is one of the worst things you can do. The public forum should really be in meetings and discussions should really be for hashing out ideas. Really, praise is often a good idea. If someone's done a good job, you want to celebrate them in that public forum or in the reply all email. But you really want to avoid addressing errors or addressing poor behavior in a public forum. You really want to address that in a private email. And again, we've talked about how email is a terrible vehicle for resolving conflict. It is, but it's a good vehicle for setting the stage and establishing the parameters around resolving a conflict. And we'll talk about that in a second. Second thing is, you're all familiar with the poop sandwich, which is layering criticism between two layers of praise. So you tell them a good thing they've done, you offer your criticism, and then you tell them another good thing they've done. This has been a management tool since I've been in management for 30 years. It's not a thing. It's not effective. Lots of research shows that when you wedge criticism between two layers of praise, you do two things. One, you dilute the criticism, and two, you undermine the praise and make the recipient question whether or not your praise is genuine in the future. So criticism in general, if you have a correction to make or something to say to somebody to address a behavior, it needs to be concise, it needs to be fact-based, and needs to be not beat around the bush and just be upfront. And so if you can do that effectively, again, over the phone or in a video conference, not by email, then you are going to go a long way towards resolving the situation and hopefully avoiding a conflict in the first place. The final thing is, I know I've said a few times to not assume that you know their motivation, but I am going to say you should always assume the person has good intent. If you spend your professional career assuming that everyone is out to get you and that every thing that happens is a personal slight, you're going to be very miserable, you're going to be very unhappy, and you're going to shortly be unemployed. You really need to make an effort and go out of your way to assume that the intent of other people's behavior is good, and just assume that you don't understand their motivation, and that that the slight was probably not deliberate. Now, there are situations where people may be deliberately slighting you, and if you end up in a reply all battle with somebody, then that's probably what's happening. But for the most part, if you assume people's intents are good, you can go a long way towards resolving that conflict and starting the process in a healthy way. So the first step is to ask permission for that conversation. So you've identified a conflict, you've managed your emotions, and now you need to enter into this conversation to resolve the conflict in some way. And it's going to have to be a conversation. First thing you need to do is ask permission to have that conversation. And you need to say, and this can be an email or a chat, but you need to say, can I talk to you about that email discussion we had yesterday? Or can I talk to you about yesterday's Teams meeting? Or can we set up a time to discuss that? It's important to establish that's what you're going to be talking about, so they're not blindsided by it when the conversation comes. But it's also important to respect their timelines in a world where you can't just walk over to the cubicle next door, tap on the wall and say, hey, can we have a chat about that meeting that just went down? It felt kind of weird. You can't do that. So it's, and you don't want to do it by chat or by email. So you really need to set up a time for a video call, or if need be, a phone call to have that conversation. Kids, dogs, life, other work priorities, stuff gets in the way. You're trying to have a serious conversation with somebody and their dog comes running in the house and it's just caught a squirrel. So chaos ensues. It's a terrible time to have the conversation. You need to be respectful of that and make sure you're having a conversation where both of you are able to focus and give your all to this task of resolving the conflict. So ask that permission, set up that time, and get ready to have that conversation. Again, like we said earlier, your opening salvo should really be all about identifying factually what happened in the conversation, identifying what you feel like you may have done wrong or contributed in some way, apologizing for that, and then seeking to come to a win-win solution where everyone's going to get some help. This is not the way to do it. this is what I call the most dangerous button in your office, and that is reply all. If you are genuinely interested in resolving conflict and getting to win-win situations, you will never ever try and do this with reply all. It's not the way to do. We talk about praise in public, criticize in private. If you have a conflict or a situation you want to resolve, you absolutely cannot do that in a reply all setting. This is the most, in my mind, one of the most toxic buttons in a work environment. It's dangerous. It's got its use, absolutely, for having discussions and conversations and hashing things out. But the minute that amygdala kicks in and the conversation gets a little more intense or a little more emotional, you need to take it out of reply all, send them a message, send them a chat, send them whatever, and say, hey, we talk about that email thread that just happened yesterday, and have a little conversation about that, because I felt it didn't go well, and I'd love to get your feedback on it. Avoid resolving things by reply all. It's the worst tool for conflict management there is. So again, if you take nothing out of this, take away the relationship is more important than the task, and take away avoiding the reply all button. There are people who use the reply all button to shame others. They use that button to score points and to shame others and to point out errors or problems or situations that have gone badly. Those people are not interested in conflict resolution, and those people's managers can see what's happening. And so this is not a tool you want to use for that. Another tool that you can use for managing your emotions and getting things out is what we call angry first drafts. Angry first drafts are that email that you write with nothing in the address header. Do not put any name in the address header, but it's that email that you write where you write what you really want to say to give that person a piece of your mind, and just exactly the way that you want to say it. You write the angry first draft, and then you put it aside and you wait for 24 hours. After 24 hours, you come back, and chances are pretty good you're going to delete that email, but at the very least, you're going to edit it heavily, and then you're going to send the email that will not ruin your career. This is a really powerful tool for managing your own emotions in a virtual world where communication is by email or by Teams or Zoom. Get what you want out. So in the retail world and in the customer service world, we call this letting the air out of the balloon. And if you have a balloon full of air and you don't allow it to escape naturally, chances are pretty it's going to pop. And what this does is it allows you to let the air out of the balloon in a healthy way, and just delete the email the next morning when you come into work and you read it, and to your horror, realize what you were feeling yesterday. That's when you delete that email. And that's when you send the email to the person that you're in conflict with that requests permission for that meeting or for that discussion to happen by telephone or by Zoom. All right. So let's get to this guy here, Dr. Moravian. Who is he? He was a psychologist in the 1960s who led a groundbreaking study on communication and how people communicate, and more importantly, how messages actually get across when people communicate and what people take away from what's communicated. And he came up with some really interesting numbers. He came up with what's called the 70-38-55 rule. And that rule is that in any type of communication or interaction, the actual words you use are really only 7% of the conversation, of the message that gets across. The tone you use is another 38%, but your body language is 55%. So a couple things. This is why things like Teams and Zoom are so valuable for conflict resolution, is because if you're genuinely in a headspace and in a mindset where you want to resolve the conflict and want to make it work better, then if the other person can see you having that conversation, you're going to do a better job of resolving that conflict. It's also why Zoom and Teams is so exhausting, is because in the end, what I'm doing right now on this little screen I got around me, it's a mini performance. Now, as a trainer, I've been doing this for the last 15 years. I'm used to this. But for a lot of people who aren't used to performing or being in front of a room or that sort of thing, that's what it feels like being on Zoom and Teams all the time. And that's why you're so tired at the end of your day. But if you're in a situation where you're trying to resolve a conflict, that 70-38-55 rule explains a whole lot of probably what's going wrong in the situation. If you have your camera turned off in a Zoom meeting and you say something, maybe trying to be clever or funny, or you offer an idea that doesn't go well, if your camera is turned off, that may be why your comment bombs is because people can't see the body language that they need to interpret that information. This is also why email communication is a terrible way of resolving conflict, is because you lose that whole 55, and unless you're an exceptionally good writer, you lose a lot of the 38 too. And so when it comes to written communication, writing also has a tone to it, and it also comes to telephone conversations. The number skews and the ratio stays similar once you eliminate the body language, and the number skews to about 85% tone and 15 to 20% words. So if you need to have a conversation with someone and you're anxious about that whole Zoom or teleconference thing or a video conference, you can have a phone conversation to resolve the conflict. And people have been resolving conflict by telephone since for 100 years, and that's not a bad tool. But if you have the ability to put yourself in front of somebody and let them see your body language and let them see you physically display the traits of a person who's genuinely interested in resolving that conflict and not making it worse, that's going to go a long way to addressing that issue. I'm right almost at the 45-minute mark. I'm pretty happy with how I timed this. So we're going to conclude. Get your questions ready. To include just a bit of a summary. The first step to resolving conflict is, one, to get your emotions under control. Control your breathing, get your amygdala unhijacked, and again, get to a point where you can focus on the facts of the situation and not your anger or how you feel. Second step, taking personal responsibility for what role you played in the conflict, probably apologizing for that, and then setting the stage for the third piece, which is a win-win solution, a win-win resolution that's going to allow the other person to save face, allow everybody to get a little bit of what they want, and everyone to go away happy. And doing so is going to give you a reputation around your organization as somebody who solves problems and resolves conflicts that is only going to help your career. And finally, doing it all digitally involves avoiding that reply all button unless necessary, avoiding, I got a question here I just saw, I'm going to answer that in 2 seconds, so hang tight. Avoiding that reply all button. It involves avoiding trying to resolve conflict by email. It involves having those conversations and asking permission for those conversations to make sure they're at a good time as much as possible. So thank you for your kind attention. I noticed that the audience view percentage slider in my GoToWebinar was really, really high throughout that whole thing. So I appreciate your careful attention. And I got a question here in the panel. How do you impact how someone receives the message despite all efforts? And I'm going to ask for just a bit more clarity on what that person means by that. So are you saying you've done everything you can to communicate clearly and the person hasn't understood your message? Is that the question I'm getting? So I'm going to proceed assuming that that's the question, unless I see otherwise in a second. If you are often having your comments misconstrued, or find yourself that you're trying to communicate with people and they're just not getting what you're trying to get across, that may be time for an objective third party to go to that person and say, what's happening? If you have a really good manager or a supervisor that you really trust and can provide that kind of feedback, that can be really valuable. Or if you have another colleague, oh, I see what that question is. Okay, good. I know where this is going. So if you have another colleague who can offer you really honest advice about your tone and your body language and all these things, that may be a solution. But what I'm seeing here is we can't control their bias. So the question I'm sort of hearing here is, how do you get through to somebody who just won't listen or won't understand what you're trying to say? So the answers, if I had the answer to that, this would not only not be a free webinar, it would be the most expensive webinar you've ever taken, because this is a problem that's been plaguing people since as long as we've had human conflict. We've had certain people on one end of a conflict who utterly refuse to acknowledge their role in the conflict and refuse to admit they've done anything wrong. And that is really, really problematic. And all I can just suggest is, if you work in an organization where that is not part of your values, then there may be an opportunity to involve somebody else in that conversation to help hold that person accountable. If you work in an organization like I have worked in many in the past, where that sort of behavior, which is kind of like a form of narcissism, goes unchecked and is often rewarded, then maybe it's time to have a good long think about your role in that organization. But that's a much more dramatic and different discussion. But there are some people who simply will not ever acknowledge their role in the conflict and acknowledge that they're just not getting it or not seeing it. I find those people are fairly rare, and I also often fall back on Albert Einstein's old famous saying that unless you can explain it to a 6-year-old, you probably don't understand it. And so I find a lot of conversations, a lot of conflicts I've been involved in, it feels like the person on the other end just isn't listening and isn't willing to come along. But I find more often than not, it's an understanding piece, and the person just can't wrap their head around what you're trying to get across. And so maybe stories or analogy or bringing in a third party to help explain it, that may be the solution as well. So I hope I've sort of addressed that to some extent. Another question here, what if the conflict happens between an employee with more power and a volunteer? So you've got a power imbalance in the conflict. So that's kind of what I was talking about in the competence gap piece, that we talked about the story with the physiotherapist and that gap between a senior and a junior person. That same kind of gap can also occur between a paid staff and a volunteer. In some cases, that volunteer is subordinate to the staff person. In other cases, that volunteer may be a board member and they may be in a position of authority over the staff person. In the end, all of this begins with taking responsibility and acknowledging whatever role you may have played in that conflict, and doing so to build a bridge. And it's an old expression of extending an olive branch to somebody, which means making a peace offering to someone and saying, I acknowledge that I had some role in this conflict. The implied expectation that they're now going to do the same doesn't always work, but I'd say the vast majority of the time I've seen this happen, it does work. And that person then acknowledges their role. So if you're the person in a position of authority with over the volunteer or the subordinate, that often requires you to really swallow your pride, and that can be a really challenging thing to do. But if you're in a person who's not in a position of authority, it's a really powerful tool to go to that person and say, hey, I understand this conflict occurred, that there was this misunderstanding or this comment was made. I'm sorry for the role I played in that. I apologize. I'd like to learn how to fix this. How can we do that? And again, that's going to really set you up as a reputation as a peacemaker and a problem solver. And I suspect the person on the other end is going to lower their guard, lower their emotional state, and become more vested in helping resolve that situation. I'm caffeinated heavily now. It's like my 5th cup today. I feel great. Any other questions? I'm happy to address them. What questions do you have? I hope this has been helpful in some way in starting your journey towards conflict resolution. I got a whole big one here. Hang on. Just curious, on a higher level, why these skills have not been applied, say, between different political parties or countries to avoid trade war, or in general, or even the extreme polarity in political agenda, because you think anyone in a leadership position would have had these skills to get where they are. Newsflash. This is why management training is a multi-gajillion-dollar industry, is because a lot of people who end up in management do not have these skills. And it's known as the Peter Principle. It's the idea of promoting somebody because they're good at their job, and then assuming that at that point they will then also be good at managing other people doing the job they used to do. And those two skills are very, very different. And conflict resolution, of being good at conflict resolution, requires a huge level of emotional self-awareness and ability to look at yourself fairly objectively and be somewhat self-reflective and say, admit when you've screwed up and admit that there's lots of different perspectives coming to the table and all those things. I have run for office twice in my life. So to answer the political thing, the short story of how you get elected is you run around to as many people as possible over either a 6 or a 1 month process and say, I am the best. And you have to convince yourself of that, and you have to convince everybody who will listen that you are the best. And somebody who's able to do a good job of that, and somebody who is able to also be self-reflective and humble, are often two very different skill sets. And often you find people who rise up in management positions are often do so because they exhibit a lot of confidence, and they put off an aura of somebody who's in charge and can take charge of situations and can take control of things. That's often what organizations reward and recognize. And that whole thing with humility and self-awareness, they don't always go hand in hand. A book I'd strongly recommend is called The H Factor of Personality, put out by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And it's a psychologist did, in the psychologists know that there are 5 basic personality characteristics. The acronym is OCEAN, so it stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, so how neurotic you are. But this H-factor personality, basically they ran studies on a much culturally broader group, so basically not all American male college students, which is what the original studies were done on. They ran a much broader cultural group, and they used much more powerful tools for crunching the data. They found out that there's actually a 6th factor personality, and that's called the humility honesty axis. And people who are low in humility and honesty can often be very compelling and very convincing when it comes to telling people why they should be in charge. And sometimes those folks get promoted, and other times in organizations that have really healthy organizational structure and a really healthy hiring practices, those people who are thoughtful and self-reflective move up through the food chain quickly. It's all about your organizational culture, what happens. But yeah, the short answer is that sometimes what we define as success in Western culture and the attributes that make you good at conflict resolution are not always the same. Getting questions about, can you contact me? Yes, I didn't put my contact information up there. How do I amend this slide real quick? I don't think I can. Contact information is, I'm on LinkedIn, Jason Allen. There are several Jason Allens in Ontario on LinkedIn, but my organization is called Third Way Consulting. So if you take a look on LinkedIn, you'll see all my information there. Please feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to do that. It's Allen with an E. So happy to connect with you there, Jason Allen, Third Way Consulting. If you want to email me, it's Jason at Jason A. Allen. So it's JASON AALLEN, double A. Don't miss the double A, or my friend, the other Jason Allen in Toronto, is going to get it. But Jason at jasonaallen.ca. Happy to discuss further. Thank you for that, John, with that recommendation on LinkedIn. But yeah, happy to talk, happy to discuss any of these things. And I had a request to share my slides, which I will also do. So I will share those slides with John afterwards, and he can distribute them or as he sees fit. And I understand a portion of this may be recorded and shared afterwards. I'm not sure. Also got a question about unconscious bias as a contributor to the root of conflict. And I would say unconsciousness in general is probably the root of a whole lot of conflict, is the ability to be aware of your own motivations, your own emotions, and an inability to, I'd say probably empathy. The lack of empathy is probably as big as unconscious bias. But yeah, unconscious bias is definitely a contributor to a lot of conflict. There's I'm reluctant to share it because it's kind of harsh, but there is a tool that I've often used in resolving conflict in my own head. That is a saying called Hanlon's razor. So you're familiar with Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law being anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Well, these are the type of aphorisms of which there are hundreds. So for instance, Godwin's law is the law of the internet, that the longer conversation goes on the internet, the more likely it is that somebody will be compared to Hitler or Nazis. That's Godwin's law. Pretty funny. But Hanlon's razor is never ascribe to malice that which can be reasonably explained by lack of knowledge. In other words, don't assume that somebody is mean or vindictive or out to get you or bad in some way. Just assume that they don't know what you know. But the corollary to that is also, you can also assume that they maybe value something that you don't value or have a motivation that you don't have. And so Hanlon's razor can also be really powerful. I've phrased it a little differently than Hanlon did, but I'll let you look that up when you get a chance. Again, slides will be available, so I'll send those over to John. You can send them around. You're probably going to look at my slides, and unless you sat through most of the presentation, you're not going to get much from the slides, because I don't do slide documents. I do like presentations, but you can you can take a look there. So thank you for that. And several people have thanked me for my candor, and that's kind of what I'm known for. That's kind of my brand. And so if you want to get the straight goods about office politics or conflict resolution or soft skills, I'm your guy. So thank you for that comment. I appreciate it.